Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on restorative practices and the integration of SEL. My name is Rachel Escobedo. I will be your moderator for today. I am the online ambassador for Sanford programs. Our speaker is Christina Holvershorn. She is the Director of Restorative and Humane Programs at Peace Learning Center. I'm going to read to you a little bit about Christina. So she is, like I said, the Director of Restorative and Humane Programs at Peace Learning Center. She began her career as a teacher and now works with schools to support training and implementation of restorative practices. She is a practitioner as well, helping schools with challenging situations through the use of restorative circles. She received her master's from the Institute for Humane Education and her specialized restorative training from the International Institute for Humane Education. All right, let's go ahead and welcome Christina Holvershorn.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the introduction. I'm really excited to be with everybody today talking about restorative practices. So I'm coming to you from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm really grateful for all of you who chose to spend some time with us today.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you. So as people continue to gather, please find your question box, and we want to know who's joining us. So if you could take just a moment and tell us where you're from and what you do there. We want to connect a little bit with our audience here.
Okay, the responses are literally flooding in, so I'll try to pick out as much as I can. School psychologist from Mesa, Arizona. We have Portland, Oregon, data analyst, third grade teacher from Indiana, teacher from Noblesville, I believe that's Indiana. Phoenix,
it is.
social worker, and a shout out to your hometown.
Yeah.
Let's see, Minneapolis Schools of Character coordinator, principal, Mesa, Arizona. We have counselors from Salem, Oregon, Montessori teacher, Fort Lauderdale, teacher from, again, Arizona. A lot of people from Arizona today. Vista, California. Oh, you're local. Principal. Let's see. School counselor from Florida. Another principal from Arizona. Let's see. Let's do two more. We have another instructional coach from Indiana. And one more shout out to Indiana. We have a music teacher from Noblesville, Indiana. Thank you so much for your participation, guys.
Yeah, so in a normal restorative conference or training, this would be when we would all literally be sitting in a circle building some community. So because this is a webinar, that was our best attempt at building a little bit of connection. So I'm excited. There's some Hoosiers among us, so shout out to our Indiana folks. So I do want to mention before we get started that we are going to have time for questions at the end. But if something comes up as we're going, please feel free to type your questions into the question box as we go, and we're going to do our best to get to them later in the webinar. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start with the why. Why are we even here talking about this? So I recently trained a group, and somebody told me that even though they had been through a number of different trainings on restorative justice, they realized that if people don't truly understand the why, they won't do anything with their new skills or strategies. And that's exactly why I take plenty of time to work through these points to ensure that there's a firm foundation. Then the strategies and implementation are far easier to do something with. So as we go through each point, I want you to reflect on the ways that these apply to your own school communities. So here's our first one. Blame, shame, punishment, and exclusion are not working for our students, teachers, or communities. So think about the sorts of blame and shame that happen in our school every day. So maybe it looks like taking a student's recess time. Maybe it's more along the lines of verbally chastising children in front of their peers. The more you think about it, the more you realize how deeply ingrained blame and shame are in everyday practice of most school environments. Now, I don't point this out to inspire guilt or shame, but to reflect on whether or not these strategies are actually helping shift behaviors or make classrooms more peaceful. So ask any student how they use their time when they're suspended from school, and most will tell you that it's leisure time. A principal recently told me he was driving from school to an offsite meeting, and he noticed a student that he had suspended the day prior doing wheelies in the sunshine. And he said that totally made him rethink the impact of suspension. So this next point, that pushing youth out of our spaces and communities is the opposite of what they need, could be considered controversial, because I know it's easy to look at students and think about how much better or simpler your classroom would be without a couple of your challenging students. So I've been there, I understand that thought. Removing them, however, takes away what they need the most: connection and access to supportive communities and services. So we must also acknowledge that pushing students out of one educational setting simply puts them in another setting where they may or may not be growing or learning what they need to learn the most. So perhaps they find their way to another school or maybe another institution, or worse yet, they don't have any safe communities to connect with. People with trauma and challenging behaviors need connection and support more than anything, and the more punitive the environment, the less likely they will be to get those tools that they need to grow. Let's keep going here. Now, this is one of the most important things that I want us to think about. When we're practicing discipline, I would argue that one of the most important guiding questions we need to keep in mind is whether or not the students are learning valuable lessons following their misdeeds. So unfortunately, most punitive discipline strategies do not teach students any new lessons. And every behavior is some form of communication. And often that communication is telling us, I don't have strategies to cope with this. So when annoyed or frustrated as a parent or a teacher, I often remind myself that students will do better when they know better. And it's up to us to make sure we're helping them learn some of these important lessons. So any of you who work on PBIS related teams know what I mean here. With any negative behavior, we want to teach a healthy and positive replacement behavior. And that's going to be a lesson that serves them their whole lives. Think of how many adults you know who you wish had someone back in third grade who would teach them things like cooperation, listening, sharing, emotional regulation, or even how to be a friend. These are really important opportunities. And this next point is that restorative practices are effective at addressing the disproportionality of discipline on students of color. This one is a particularly poignant point for many of us. This is the reason why a lot of schools are considering adopting restorative practices in the first place. So across the country, there's tons of data that we are suspending and expelling students on the basis of race disproportionately. So even when the infractions are the same, frequently we see an application of harsher disciplinary strategies to students of color, particularly our Black boys, followed by Latino boys. So restorative practices are responsive to the needs of students and the needs of communities, making this an extremely meaningful way to address this disproportionality. This area is one of my own greatest motivators. Our discipline system is simply not working for many of our students. So why wouldn't we work with everything we have to create a system that works for everybody? The stakes are so high, the school to prison pipeline is a reality, and this work has very positive real life implications for our students, and all students deserve a system that works for them. We'll keep going here. Now, I want educators among us to look at this first idea, that traditional discipline works best for those who need it the least. So I would predict that traditional discipline worked okay for many of us who made our way into the field of education. And I know that because we were able to succeed in varying degrees of education and make it to where we are. So it's important for us to consider that often in light of this, we duplicate and replicate what worked for us. And we need to be aware that that isn't the system necessarily that everybody else needs. So many of us acknowledge that suspension and expulsion are not desirable. That said, without anything in their place, schools can become places where students continually push boundaries. So simply removing these punitive responses is not enough. We have to replace them with sound and effective strategies to help our students learn from their mistakes and to connect with one another in meaningful ways. And this last point brings together a number of relevant topics in education today. So as we learn more about trauma and its impact on behavior, neuroscience, and all these other fascinating best practices aligned with positive behavior supports and building healthy school communities, it becomes useful for us to find ways to identify some of these and connect some of these seemingly disparate concepts. So restorative practices really helps us tie all these together as a common vehicle to achieve many ends. The work we do in restorative practices is well aligned with the emerging research from all of these fields. And a principal I work with recently told me all roads lead back to restorative practices. And I'm glad to hear that, because I know that these strategies work and they're very powerful. So just said a mouthful there, but I want to take just a minute to reflect on, are there any pieces of that that really challenged you, or what really resonates with your experience? So take just a second, find that question box, and let's see if we can have a little bit of time to reflect and connect with one another on some of your ideas.
Christina, what might be helpful is if we show them just to one of the slides, just so they can reflect on that. Okay,
Good
we
thought.
have some responses coming in. One person says, oh goodness, okay, here they come. One person says, sounds excellent and true. Looking forward to the what to do with the violent child who is not safe in the class. She says, one other person says, I agree completely. It is hard when the teacher wants a hard consequence.
Yep.
How as adults we need to change our practices. I agree. Traditional discipline works best for those that need it least. Students often need more than traditional discipline and more innovative interventions. One person says, I'm challenged by changing the mindset of teachers.
Hey, you guys are hitting it right on the head. That's what this work is. This work is about, it's never about fixing children. It's about addressing what adults can do and how we can shape environments to bring out the best in our kids.
Definitely. And the person says, yes, second the fact that traditional methods of discipline favor children with privilege.
Mm-hmm.
One person says, I've noticed my black male students, first grade, has significant traumatic issues. As a second-year teacher, I was not equipped with strategies to help them cope and succeed in a classroom while also trying to, trying to something each content and maintain classroom management.
Yep.
Another person says, I find that it's a hard shift for some teachers who are old school in terms of punishment and unwillingness to teach appropriate behaviors.
And you guys fully, I mean, clearly you understand school culture. And so to make this change, I always pushed for this to be a whole school initiative. So everybody is on the same page, because you can imagine how hard it is to do this on an island. That said, there's plenty that you can do individually, but absolutely the work often, and the thing that I recommend the most is adopt some of this, and other people will notice and come alongside you when they see the kinds of successes that you're having, especially with the challenging kiddos.
I'm going to continue to read a few more of these. Another person says, we are still and guilty of practicing removing recess, and it is mostly, unfortunately, for boys. Looking forward to new strategies to teach students to cope with life and support lifelong learning skills. Another person says, it makes sense and I'm in full agreement. However, my teachers need a better toolbox for consequences instead of traditional punitive consequences.
Sounds like a perfect place to keep moving. I totally agree. And that's, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's exactly why we're here.
All right. Thank you so much for everyone's participation.
I love it. I can tell I'm surrounded by my people. So let's keep going. Many of us are definition kind of people, and I was having a hard time in all my work in restorative practices finding a definition that I liked, so I had to come up with one on my own. So I really want to introduce this idea that restorative practices, these are a continuum of behaviors that emphasize relationships and communities. You'll probably hear me say those words a lot today. They help us prioritize these relationships in our schools and classrooms so that we can withstand problems and conflicts. So think about that for a minute. If we don't have those relationships intact, it's going to be really hard to weather the behavior issues and all of the problems that can happen in a school environment. And that's not just teacher to student, that's teacher to teacher, that's everybody. So restorative justice is the work that we do when harm has already been done. So that's what we do sort of as a reaction. It involves bringing together all parties, listening fully. That's really the most important thing about this work, truly listening to each other, and then addressing the harm in a way where the relationships are tended to and the consequences are co-created by all participants. And this is really important too, and supports are put in place to help those harmed and make sure that the offender is less likely to reoffend. So I hope that gives you a sort of overarching idea of what we're really talking about here. And a principal that I work with recently just said, you know, I just think restorative practices are a way of being. And I really appreciated that. It's not a binder or you know, a program. It's really a philosophy. And if this is undergirding the way that we interact with one another and our children, that's when we really see impact. So I want to introduce you to one of my very favorite diagrams. So this is the diagram that I have seen help so many educators become more confident about the ways that restorative practices can help us create better learning environments. So let's be honest, when people hear the terminology restorative practices or restorative justice, they often think it means we're going to sit in a circle, tolerate negative behaviors, and that we're just going to have to stop teaching and learning. If I had a nickel for every time somebody said, are we going to sing Kumbaya? I would be a rich woman. So this couldn't be further from the truth. So I really want to give you some tools to help introduce these ideas to your fellow teachers, because I've heard that a lot already today, that bringing along people who are used to traditional discipline to even consider this as an alternative. So this is an important diagram, I think, for you to be able to take with you and use. So let's dive into this diagram so you can see what I mean. So we've got this x-axis. This is our support. So think about the kinds of support we can offer in schools. Think about all the ways that people can feel supported. So my favorite ways of supporting children are free. A welcoming hello, listening truly to student opinions and ideas, truly taking an interest in them, and then all the ways that we can enhance the experience in school a little bit more formally. So things like counseling, social emotional learning opportunities, food, all of these things that we can use to help kids reach their potential. Sometimes to understand this axis, I just ask people to reflect on what do you need in your own work environment to feel supported? And then all of a sudden we know exactly what we're talking about here. So someone to listen to me, someone to hear out my ideas, someone to give me access to resources when I need them, right? Okay, so that's our x-axis. Let's talk about our y-axis. So these are the boundaries that we need to have in place in order to have that healthy and productive classroom. So these are the rules or agreements made that help us ensure safety. They're the words we can and cannot say. They're the physical spaces we occupy and the boundaries that students learn not to cross. Now, interestingly, these differ by schools. So a child who moves from one school to another or one state to another, they're trying to understand these boundaries every step of the way. I would also argue that one of the best ways to make sure that kids are going to honor these is to give them a bit of autonomy over the rules that are going to govern them. So I believe these boundaries are impositions of our own cultural norms. So when we open up and discuss these and come to some common agreements with our students, we're so much more likely to bring out positive behaviors in our students. So these large capital letters refer to the ways that we walk with students through challenging situations. So in this lower left quadrant, for example, when a student does harm, we don't do anything with or to them. Behavior is ignored, more or less. The bottom right quadrant, that's where we become permissive and do things for students. So sometimes we make excuses for them. We might gloss over their problems by justifying their behavior, right? Sometimes we see this in parents as well. So then we move up here to the top left, and that's where we insist on a lot of boundaries and control, but we're not offering any support to ensure that students can reach those expectations. So our reaction to challenging behaviors is normally a swift punishment, and we do nothing to help students learn from those mistakes. Instead, we just kind of hope that that punishment is going to be the lesson that they need. So let's move over here. This is where we aim to be. This is where our responses are actually restorative, where we have enough support to ensure that all students can reach those boundaries. So take a moment and reflect on what's happening in each quadrant. So just with one word, I want you to type a word of what you think, let's say what students are doing in this environment. So take a second and type a word to describe what students might be doing down here.
All right, some of the responses are coming in. We have chaos, negative attention, negative attention seeking, withdrawing, anything and everything, playing, disengaged, unfocused, harm, disrespect, acting out, unstructured, angry behavior, calling out, making their own rules, survival of the fittest, that's an interesting one, daydreaming, distracting, just see disrespect, and undesired behavior increases. Let's do one more, defiant.
All right, you guys, you nailed it. I I was with a teenager talking about this yesterday, and she said, "Have you ever read Lord of the Flies?" I was like, "Yes, you nailed it there." So let's move over here. And instead of what the student is doing, what do you think a teacher or an adult might be doing in this zone? Take a second and type real quickly some things that you think might be happening from an adult.
We have making excuses, disengaged, low expectations, too much assistance to complete a task. We got a lot of making excuses, enabling, hovering, helicopter, defeat and immediate disengagement, feeling powerless, being their friend, do things for the child rather than modeling for them.
Yep.
Student waiting for teachers to give the answers, ignoring behavior, doing it for them, and we'll do one more. Let's see, lack of consistency of expectations from classroom to classroom.
Excellent. You guys are on it. So you know exactly what this looks like. And I think, we might float in between these zones. So on a day that you might be particularly understanding of a student, you might slip into this and then reflect back and think, oh, I needed to hold that child a little bit more accountable. What about up here? So this one, think about, for this is a slightly different question. If you've ever been in this space where a teacher or a boss was functioning in this way, how did you feel? So type in a word or two about how does it feel to try to function in this space as a student or an employee?
Oh boy, these are really coming in fast. Okay, we have embarrassed, shame, frustrated, bullied, stressful, not heard, demoralized, anxious, suffocating, cringeworthy, micromanaged, intimidated, undermined, walking on eggshells, give up, not worth trying harder, restricting, undermined, sad, dignity not intact. I'll leave it at that one.
Nice. So, I think you guys have a very clear picture of exactly what each of these quadrants are trying to define. Now we're going to take the rest of our time today to really delve into what can this actually look like. And something that's really interesting to me is that this is often the hardest for people to define because many of us have not had the privilege of walking with someone when we've done harm. And I think it's once you've done it and once you've seen it, it's really hard not to be so enthusiastic about how powerful it can be. So to help this diagram come to life, I want us to imagine what might happen if you're late to work, okay, and you're caught speeding in a school zone. So I'm not sure about California. I know here in Indiana, our school zones are often about 20 miles an hour. Now, most of us would agree that that boundary of a low speed limit in a school zone is a wise and thoughtful boundary. So most of us agree that this is a useful boundary. But I bet many of us have done it. I'm not going to ask you to give yourself away, but I bet many of us have done it. So I want us to think about what an officer might do in each of these quadrants. So if this happens, that officer is barely looking up from what he or she is doing. Definitely not even pulling us over. So if I'm in this zone, I think, this is a place I can speed. The officer even saw me do it, so that all of a sudden is no longer a boundary for me because it's going to get ignored. Now, if I move over here, now that officer might pull me over and be really understanding because I might say, well, look, I was going to be late to work. And they might even give us a police escort to work or a pat on the back. Good for you. You're a teacher. I love teachers. You go on your way, right? Maybe a warning. Okay, so in this is exactly what happens most of the time, right? Because we use punitive justice in our own criminal justice system. So a ticket, a court date, some kind of punishment. So that's pretty predictable. Now this one we have to get really creative because this is not something that we equip officers with in terms of time or budgets or anything. But let's just imagine what might happen. Can you imagine if that officer had an appropriate level of support to match that understandable and useful boundary? So think about that officer asking to look in your planner or your alarm clock to ensure that you're managing your time effectively. Because after all, that's a lagging skill. If you're constantly speeding, time management is the thing that you need support with, right? Could you imagine the officer coming up with a way to teach us that lesson, like meeting the child who had been hit by a car in a school zone? Every time I think about that, I get chills and I think I would never speed again if that was happening. So all of these are examples of what supportive and restorative consequences could look like. They're just as much about learning new skills to replace those old skills as focusing on the harm that's been done. They're also the most likely balance of support and boundary setting to ensure that we're going to make healthy and positive choices. So you can see why that framework is a really important thing because it's so easy to jump over here or over here, especially when we're upset or stressed. So I want to introduce a few concepts here because often seeing the difference between a punitive and restorative approach is the way that people, really begin to understand this work. So with punitive justice, we almost exclusively focus on the past. We think about blame and guilt, and we just dwell on that. With restorative practices, we address what happened, and then we really tune into the now. How are people feeling and what needs are still out there? And then we spend a lot of time thinking about the future and how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Now, this one, people chuckle at this, that we impose pain or unpleasantness, but this is a very real thing. I bet you in your teaching or parenting, you've thought for a moment, how can I make this consequence so unpleasant that they'll never want to do it again? I don't think this comes from a mean or evil place, but we have this idea very, very deeply within us that if we make this so unpleasant, they'll never do it again. With restorative practices, we really think that restitution is the way to restore things, and we're really focused on that relationship and reconciliation, and then also fully acknowledging responsibility for choices. This last one's fairly self-explanatory. We typically, in a punitive system, we just focus on a due process, a very predictable sort of rule-based approach. With restorative practices, what we're really focused on are those relationships and the parties involved coming up with an outcome that's mutually desired. So to illustrate this, I wanted to share a couple of stories from real circles. I get a lot of feedback that it's through stories that this actually makes sense to people. So as I tell these stories, I want you to try to see the ways that restorative responses differ from these punitive responses. So one of my very favorite stories comes from a second grade classroom. So the teacher was amazing. She was building relationships. She was an amazing teacher, but she was having a problem. And so she called in one of our facilitators from Peace Learning Center to help her with a circle to deal with the challenge that she was having. So somebody had been stealing some of the classroom materials. So the facilitator in the circle started by, first of all, defining theft. She wasn't convinced that all the children understood the boundary of what they could and couldn't take home. She then offered a chance for anyone to explain the impact that these missing materials had on them. So when it came time for the teacher to share, she was told to share honestly and openly. Now think of how rarely as adults we get to be honest and open about our feelings or our reactions to situations. So as it turned out, a lot of the items that were disappearing were actually given to the class from her own children. So they understood that their mom's school didn't have a lot of money for supplies. And so seeing these items it really packed an extra punch for this teacher. So she cried and she told them that she really cared for them and wanted to trust them, but hasn't been able to. And that was really hard for her. So as the circle drew to a close, the students were talking about how would they react if someone came forward? What did they think should happen next? So the students were beginning this problem solving, and one little guy walked up, got his backpack, and to everyone's amazement, he began taking out the items that he had stolen. Now, no one saw this coming, and the teacher took him to the side and asked him to look into her eyes, and she wisely said, "Do I look mad at you?" And he responded, "No." And she explained that she was so proud of him for doing the right thing, for making such a good choice. And he opened up to her that he was in foster care, and she quickly understood what he was doing. He was taking bits and pieces of a loving and supportive community home to where he needed them the most. So they had a conversation about the impact of the theft, which truly had been addressed very well by the whole group, and then talked about how he could meet his need to have some toys and activities at home. So together, they decided to create a procedure for him to check out materials. So he learned an appropriate way to meet his needs, and his relationship with his teacher and peers actually improved. And he learned a really valuable lesson that didn't involve punitive measures, that especially in his case would have probably done more harm than good. So let's look how this happened. The focus really wasn't about the stealing. They could have talked about the stealing for for a week, but really they focused in on that problem solving, and the teacher had time to really be heard, and her needs were also truly addressed. And then the restitution, what was important, the relationship, and that stuff returned to class. So he was able to return what he did. He was able to right his wrong and then take some responsibility for the choice that he made. And ultimately, those people were all going to be in the same classroom for the rest of the year. And so they needed a way to agree upon the way to move forward. And those relationships were the most important thing to tend to in that example. Let's do another one. So these are a few other ideas, and I joke that if I ever were to get a restorative justice tattoo, it would be accountability does not equal punishment. So think about that for a second. It's very ingrained in us that we can't be held accountable if we don't receive punishment. And in a restorative lens, we really think that accountability is when we understand the impact of our actions and truly take responsibility and fix them. That's what we're after. Also, we have this idea that without punishment, people will not be deterred or learn. And I would argue that really true deterrence, and think about this in your own life, is much more linked to relationships and personal accountability. We're very used to one-size-fits-all approach and zero tolerance. In restorative work, we really believe that the outcome and consequence should always be determined by the circumstances, because everybody's situation is a little bit different. And then last but not least, we really want to focus on repairing that harm and working towards a positive outcome. This can't be a mindless task, if A, then B sort of thing. This really needs to be something where we're focused on repairing that harm. So here's another story. I was recently called into a high school to help with a situation involving a student who had done $1,500 worth of damage to his school with a fire extinguisher. Also broken some windows. It was a whole big thing. So we invited the dean who was involved in the incident, the student, his parent, as well as the custodian. So it was a really meaningful circle, and truly it's something that impacted all of us. So the circle began with an explanation of the harm he caused, and each participant was able to address it in an open and honest way. So the student admitted to his part in it, and he didn't really have a very satisfying explanation, aside from it was a joke and that he and his friends thought it was funny. So be ready. Kids often, if we're going to ask them the question, why did you do that? They don't often have very satisfying responses. And I think it has much more to do with their brains and their brains not being fully developed. And they sometimes just make some questionable choices. Anyway, the mother had previously told me that she didn't have money to pay for the restitution, but that she was willing to participate in the conference. So the dean opened up that this had made her doubt her own abilities as an administrator. So you can see that she's being very vulnerable. And the mother opened up as a mom who was deeply and sincerely concerned for the child. And this paved the way for others, including the custodian and the student, to actually shed a tear. So as soon as people began seeing the humanity and the true effect of this on others, it became a really vibrant circle. So the custodian actually explained that this young man reminded him so much of himself when he was younger, and he was beginning to make many of the same mistakes that he had made. And it was at that point that the mother volunteered something that surprised us all. She said that the young man had actually won a legal settlement from an injury that he received, and that he had money in the bank and could be released if the judge received an official request. So I was surprised by this, but it seemed fair. So I began writing an agreement about how this would be paid out. And you wouldn't believe it, the dean actually stopped me, and she was the one who had filed for his expulsion. And she said, I don't think that that's going to be necessary. So we sat and came up with an agreement that involved this student. It was a pretty lengthy agreement, but it involved the student working with the custodian for the rest of the year during his study hall to help undo the harm that he caused. It also involved a whole lot of supportive mechanisms to get this kid back on track, and to be able to make healthier choices. And the school was so excited that this helped him get back on the right track, and it really helped him turn over a new leaf. And I look back on this story, and I was so grateful that this young man was given a second chance and the support that he needed. Kids often tell me that it's in circles that they realize that their teachers really care. So think about what that means. That means that in the days, months, or even years leading up to that conference, they truly didn't understand or believe that the adults really cared or wanted them to succeed. So think about that. Hold that thought for a minute. And you can go back here and see that accountability can look like a lot of things, and it doesn't have to look like punishment. And deterrence, you know, to wrong someone who you have a deep relationship with, it is so much harder. So we use these conferences and all of this work to deepen those relationships. And, the outcome and consequences, they're different every time because the circle is different every time. So the group itself determines what comes next. And you build a rich, diverse group of people. So that means that the student, the social worker, all of these brilliant minds that you have in your school, you truly listen to one another. And I've seen some amazing consequences and outcomes come from this. And again, you can see that when we repair the harm, that effort towards a positive outcome is pretty amazing. So I just want you to take a minute and reflect on this quote, because so much of this is about storytelling. This just sums up so much about what I've come to love about this work. In traditional discipline, we rarely take time to share these stories, and certainly we never help co-create shared stories and a new story of how we wade through the mess of conflict and come out intact. So these are powerful moments, and once you've seen people bravely and humbly meet in the middle, share power, and then rebuild those relationships, it's hard not to be enthusiastic about this work. All right. So you're probably thinking, okay, this sounds great, but what does it look like? I would say thank you for the great introduction. So here is a diagram with some of what we recommend. So the idea here is that we do enough of the universal work, which is really preventative relationship building. The other pieces are going to be so much more impactful. So let's talk about these. The first thing that I recommend through seeing what works and doesn't work, I recommend at any grade level that you're taking at least 10 minutes a day to slow down, build community, and connect all of the learners together. And that means with the adult that they're working with. So this could be an advisory period for junior high or high school. This could be a morning meeting. This can take a lot of forms. But the simplest thing to do is a question of the day, where the students are invited to share and connect on topics that they find relevant. Most of this is going to be related to social emotional learning, and most of this is going to be building their toolbox to help them navigate conflict, find good, healthy communication strategies, and such. So we also recommend that students have some say in the rules that will govern them. So thinking through our boundaries, that helps us ensure that the rules are culturally relevant, fair, and that students will simply take them seriously. Now, another really important aspect of this is the application of social emotional learning. So students need access to those skills and tools to help them navigate relationships, emotions, communication, and all those elements that make a healthy and whole person. So there's so many excellent programs out there. Sanford Harmony, Tribes, there's a whole lot more. The main element is that we have to make time to teach these skills. So we also encourage some kinds of specific responses to misbehavior. So some of you are asking for a really specific tool. One of them is the effective statement. It's very similar to an iMessage, but it's simply asking the adult in the room to reflect back how that action is affecting them. So for example, if a kid has their head down, the traditional response would be, get your head up, sit up and do your work, okay? Now, if an effective statement would be something like, I'm really concerned that you have your head down. So you're expressing your own reaction, your own how that's affecting you. So I'm concerned that you have your head down again today in class. Is there something going on? So the statement isn't going to fix it. The statement is building an emotional bridge to somebody who needs it. So you're trying to check in, you're trying to build that bridge to begin a healthier conversation. So, you know, another tool that's referenced here are these the effective questions. And these are the questions that we use to help bring people together and understand the harm that's been done and ultimately co-create ways to right those wrongs. So without the time to actually train you on these questions, I will say that most of my trainings are about 7 hours, so I'm kind of in fast forward here. But I will tell you that things are going to go a lot better when instead of the first question you ask is why, or what were you thinking? Those are the kinds of things that fly out of our mouths when we're frustrated. We start all restorative conversations with what happened. So that is our best, that gives us the best odds of opening up a positive conversation. So I want you to think about messing up a project at work. If your boss approaches you with what happened, that opens the door to healthy conversation and problem solving with one another. So that's one really important thing. I have a lot to say about this blue foundation of this pyramid because I think it's pretty neglected in this work. So I have so much to say that I co-wrote and published a paper on it, and it's linked in the handout that will be in your chat box. That could be a useful thing also to bring back to your school. I definitely think it's worth a read, and it helps you contextualize some of these pieces. Also, some of these practices, among another of other really important concepts, are available in a free guide entitled Justice for All. And I wrote a lot of lesson plans that you can take and use in this realm. So that's available for free. So those 2 free resources are available in the handout, and I believe they're also in the chat box. So if you download the handout, you can click on that, and they're both free, and I definitely recommend them because we're, as you can tell, only able to kind of scratch the surface on some of this stuff. All right, so sorry about that. As we move up the pyramid, it's time to repair relationships. Things are going to go wrong. So we can address these situations in lots of ways, but a responsive circle, that's when the whole class works together to solve a problem. So that was the stealing example. You wouldn't know who to have a small circle with, so you could do a whole group responsive circle, peer mediation, or restorative chat. So that's one of the tools that we really recommend. So that's a format where we work beside a small group, asking meaningful questions to help them reflect on their choices and how they can move forward. This is giving them hands-on opportunities to solve problems themselves. And the very top of this pyramid, these are those restorative conferences. So that's for the other example I gave, the student who had done so much damage to his school. So these are the formal practices that bring together students, parents, and anybody else affected by harmful choices. So the conference is intended to address the harm and fairly quickly pivot to work together to come up with an agreement. So this is a basic overview of what some of this work could actually look like. So I'm going to take just a minute. We're going to try to cover a few of these myths, and then we're going to get to some questions. So I'm going to try to go through this really quickly. But I want to give you a couple examples of accountability because this is such an important thing for us to try to understand. And I think that this first one is just a consequence of our culture's deeply held belief that punishment and accountability are the same thing. But I want to give you a couple examples specifically of circles I've done around hate speech. So I can't imagine too many things more difficult to walk through together than that. And I want to give you a couple really, really tiny examples from that. In one circle, there was a student who had been calling another student in his class a racial slur. And the moment of accountability for that student really came when he had to listen to the other student's mom say the following. She said, "Do you know what it's like to send your child, your baby, off to school every day, knowing that they are going to be called something so painful that I can't help them through it? I need you to understand why this is more than a word to our family." So that was the beginning of that student taking accountability for the ways that he was using language to hurt one another. So I won't belabor the whole consequence of all of that, but really what the group realized was that that young man needed education on some of the language, and he needed ways to be able to talk through conflict. And so that's kind of where that circle landed. Another one that I dealt with religious hate speech, I had some students ask for just a moment to really explain their faith, because they understood that there was all of this Islamophobia out there and nobody really understood anything about their faith. And interestingly, they weren't Muslim at all. They were Sikh, and then there was all this confusion. And so for them, accountability meant that person having to sit and listen to them explain something that they knew they didn't understand. So witnessing instance after instance like this has shown me that punishment is actually the easy way out. So if I do wrong, I won't have to sit with it, see it from the other perspective, and then have to come up, what I'm going to have to do is come up with ways to make it right and learn from it. So this next idea is that kids will never learn if their lesson if they're let off the hook. And I can't disagree with this one more. If you sit and listen to the stories, you're so much more on the hook. And I would argue, think about problem solving for a minute. So how do you get better at basketball? You practice. How do you get better at your math facts? You practice. How do you get better at problem solving? You practice. And we have to create time and space for kids to sit and struggle with how to fix the wrong that I've done. And I can't tell you the number of times when I think, man, this is rough. This is way rougher for a child to go through than a simple suspension. But every time you can see growth, and you can see the relationships can fix themselves in really meaningful ways. And last but not least, it's not showing up. Maybe Rachel can help me with that one. I'll explain that last but not least, this idea that restorative practices is a burden on teachers. So we want, there it is. This is an interesting idea. Research actually shows the opposite. So research is telling us that implementing restorative practices actually increases teacher morale and retention. So yes, there's new tasks involved, but the teacher is now empowered to intervene in ways that previously had only been reserved for social workers and administrators. So this puts actually a little bit more power with the teacher to be able to articulate what they need from a situation and the kinds of support that they need from those outside of their classroom. So this is redistributing power. And one thing that I really like about it as a teacher, I constantly felt like I had to solve every problem. So I was constantly trying to be creative and come up with these amazing consequences or outcomes. And I was doing all the work, and my students were not getting any practice doing that. So again, this is sharing the conflict and really spreading that out on the shoulders of everybody who's involved. So I had a teacher who I trained, and she actually went on to become a restorative justice coach. And she told me, "Christina, don't tell people that this is hard work. It's actually way easier than constantly getting worked up, having to solve every problem myself, and getting wrapped up in power struggles. That's what's hard." So I agree that comparatively this is easier. Invest the time in relationships, walk alongside students so that when they struggle, you're listening, and then you help them learn better ways of handling things. This way is much easier. So yes, it might seem like a lot at first, but soon it's simply just a way of being, and one that students resist a lot less than traditional discipline. All right, so I want you to take a minute and think of any questions that you have. This is a quote to kind of get you thinking, and I wanted to take some time to answer some questions. So I'll let Rachel jump back on, and if there's any questions, we can take a few minutes for those.
Okay, thank you so much, Christina. While you guys are entering your questions, we have one to start. So this question says, how do you see SEL integrated into restorative practice? Specifically, how would you use the Sanford Harmony curriculum within restorative constructs?
So if I were the principal of a school or a decision maker in, any school or school district, that's where I would start. I'm not going to pretend like I can do these meaningful, amazing circles without a foundation of connection and SEL. So the bottom of that pyramid that I just showed you, that's where Sanford Harmony in particular would fit. And I love that there's a program out there that we know works, that's really accessible and that kids actually think is fun. So I think that's I would use that as my first initiative, and I would probably just bite that off year one. So all we're going to do is really tackle the bottom of that pyramid. When we build those SEL skills and build those relationships, the rest is actually pretty easy. I know that sounds ridiculous, especially given some of the challenging schools that you work in. But when we invest that time, everything else kind of follows. So it's the foundation. SEL is the foundation of all of this work.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, so this next question, I'm going to read it out loud, but I'd like you to wait to answer it because I think you're going to cover this in your summary slide. But this person is asking, what is a good next step? So just hold that thought and we will get to that. What would next steps look like for you? Okay, another question is how do I implement a daily practice to create an atmosphere and culture of restorative practices? So a daily practice.
Yeah, so a literal circle is important. So I would sit with my students and I would dedicate that time. I would first ask them to come up with their own agreements in general for the classroom. And you got to remind them of those. You got to really work with those. That's going to be your common language for how we treat one another. And then I would spend time in that circle, and I would start making it fun. There's tons of really fun SEL activities out there that are going to make kids connect that time with something that they want to be part of. And then it becomes sacred. Then it becomes this thing that if you dare not actually do the circle, your kids will remind you. So I would start with that circle. So that's that proactive time that you're connecting. And here's the trick, the teacher actually has to take part in it. So if you're asking a question about, and my very favorite way to do this, to be honest, is have the kids put questions in a jar. Double check to make sure they're PG before you read them out loud, and then go around, because the kids' questions are way more entertaining and amusing than our questions would be. So they're simply asking the questions that they want to know of their peers, building community, taking time to make those connections, and you're participating. So you're on the hook for participating and explaining your own thoughts. And those can also be used for real clear SEL concepts. How do we handle anxiety? What's something that works for you when you're really mad to calm down? Things like that.
Thank you. And I wanted to just mention one thing in relation to the first question we asked. If anyone is interested in our Sanford Harmony program, I will leave you with some contact information at the end here. And if you have any questions about how to get started with us, what does implementation look like, I'd be more than happy to help you get started. All right, let's move on to our next question. So do circles typically take place during the school day or outside of the day? And then the second part of it is, do circles need to be held quickly after behavior?
All right, that's a really good question because you're already talking about logistics. So the proactive circles, absolutely, that's during the classroom, but I suspect you're talking about these circles as a reaction to some harm that's been done. So there's no easy answer about when is the right time to have the circle. If it's something that is going to be a huge deal, if it's not addressed, go ahead and deal with it. But I always think it's better to wait. So if I sleep on it, I can say for myself, if I'm really upset about something, the next day, my participation in a conversation is going to be much more calm and thoughtful. Kids are no different. So don't feel bad. Some of the circles that I'm describing, there was a week or 3 weeks between the time of the incident and the time of the circle. So don't think you have to tie everything up with a bow just because the bell rings and it's the end of the day. If you can usually if you tell kids, we are going to make time to talk about this, I want you to think about the things that you want to say, and then give them the estimated time of when they're going to be ready to do that. So I think waiting a little bit is fine. I've seen schools get really creative with this. So I've seen teachers support each other, support other teachers by covering their class for the 5 minutes it might take for a teacher to walk through the conversation with their students. I've seen schools totally flip it, and the person who otherwise would be receiving students in the office, the dean, the principal, maybe even the social worker, comes in and I will watch your class for the 10 minutes it takes so that you can have time to figure this out with your student. So this is a totally different way of thinking about discipline, but teachers often really respond to that because they actually get the time to do what they need to do, which is have that sort of smaller conversation with a couple of kids. I think I answered all of those.
Yes, you did. Thank you. All
Okay.
right. Thanks, Christina. So our next question is, how do you do this with our youngest children who may not be emotionally able to have these conversations and listen to other people's stories with empathy?
Yeah, so the youngest kids can be the most challenging, but this is also a really, really great time for them to see and to learn what this looks like. So I've seen kids as young as preschool respond and be able to navigate this. One of the key questions um, that often throws little kids is we ask, how did this affect other people? And if they don't know what the word affect means, they can't give us a very satisfying answer. So my suggestion is not to change that, but it is um, to make sure that we're teaching that language. And then the nice thing about a student to student conflict, they're speaking each other's language. So they're not going to be speaking over one another's heads necessarily. And to simplify it, and those are going to be very, very quick responses. But what better way to prepare them as their emotions continue to get bigger and the conflicts get messier for the mechanism to do this? And so I've actually seen really young kids do a nice job. And if a kid, let's say a kindergartner, rolls their eyes or is doing something, you're lying, the sorts of things that kindergartners might do, um, that's a moment to stop and ask the other student to use an effective statement. That really hurts me when you say that. So we're literally breaking down all of these skills and teaching it to them. And I've seen really young kids totally understand this and be able to use it.
Thank you. All right, our next question. How do you shift a staff who is used to punitive measures on students? I am all about restorative, and my staff fights it. What is the best way to get them on board?
Honest answer, I'm still looking for that magic wand that can shift that. No, but what I would say is start small and don't expect everybody to come alongside you. Um, there's a really nice paper that was published, and it was some researchers looking at Denver, and they did a lot of restorative practices in Denver, and they looked at where did it work. And one of the things that they had to have in place was administrative understanding and administrative buy-in. So you might be the person who starts this, and then you get the attention of your administrator and a small team, and then you're unstoppable. So understand that this might be slow. What I see so often is a couple of amazing teachers who get this and who live this. And as soon as they get the attention of their administration, then all of a sudden they have the floor to say, well, this is what I do, and this is what works. Then you're shifting the dynamic. It's not some top-down thing. This is something that we do in this building because it works, and it's really important to train everybody in this. So if you don't have the means or the time to do training, there's lots of really good books out there. You're welcome to my Twitter is on there, or reach out to me. My email is on the Peace Learning Center webpage as well. Reach out and I can give you some books. I think a book read or a book study together is a really great place to start, because often it's a place of not understanding. And I really love that social discipline window, because it shows them that we actually can still have boundaries. So we're not trying to recreate the Lord of the Flies. We're actually trying to have a safe, calm environment where we're also holding kids accountable and giving them support. But it is hard. Just be ready. The adults,
Okay.
not the kids.
So, all right, we have 1 more minute, and I want to respect everyone's time, but we have so many questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But let's take 2 more if you want. If you guys want to hang on for a couple more minutes, I'm going to address just 2 more questions. So, the next question is, wait, where did it go? There it is. Are there any tools, survey questions, etc., to help with a needs assessment or review of current practices?
Yes, so there's actually a lot of really good stuff out there. Some schools there's really great climate and culture surveys that are really useful. I actually just found a published paper that had the actual tools that they used in a number of evaluations that I'm beginning to also use. There's a published piece out of the department, I want to say the education department in Minnesota, similarly has a whole bunch of really great tools. So reach out to me either via Twitter or email, and I'm happy to try to get you some of those tools, because I think that's a really great place to start, is an actual honest assessment of where you are, because that's a wise way to help influence your other teachers, especially if you're getting student and parent input.
Thank you. And before I read the next question, we had a nice comment come in. I'm just going to read her comment out loud. This person says that they have the Sanford Harmony materials and have found them to blend beautifully with restorative practices. She said, we started with the circles, then added the meet up, buddy up as an important component for our students. Thank you so much for your comment. That really means a lot to us. Okay, our last question is,
can I add something about
yes,
Sanford?
Yes.
I actually have a set of your question cards that we use at the dinner table. So all of these practices I think are really relevant for families as well. Just taking the time to connect and build community works for everybody. And if I put those questions away, my 7-year-old daughter frequently reminds me, bring them back out. We need to have good, conversation at dinner.
Oh my God, that's so cute. Yeah, we use our cards with our staff. Those cards can be used with adults too. They're a lot of fun. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that you're using them at the dinner table. All right, our last question is, what if we already have a code of conduct that follows suspensions? Do we ignore those? Do we need to change the whole code of conduct?
So that's a really good question. And I would actually argue, I don't know what state you're in, pay attention to some of the state legislation happening, because I will say in Indiana, state law just passed that says schools actually need to make sure that they're able to access restorative practices in their school. Now, if that's happening in Indiana, I can't imagine where some of our other states who are maybe a little bit further along that continuum, let me say, are. So pay attention to some of the laws that could already be in your favor. And I say yes. We've actually had a lot of success changing our school district's policy. So we have a continuum of supports in Indianapolis Public Schools now. And it was really just a cohort of people who worked for the school and parents who said, what if we considered different ways to do discipline? In Chicago, where I used to live, restorative practices came in on the scene because parents demanded it. And so, yeah, you can change stuff, and sometimes you got to make a little bit of trouble, and that's actually a really good thing if it's the right thing for our kids. So sometimes that is something to work towards, especially if your discipline policy is being used to say, oh, we couldn't possibly do these things. So yeah, the summary is up here, and I just wanted to, these are the most important thing, is that these relationships matter. Whatever we're doing to build those relationships, the rest of this is going to work. And that conflict and misbehavior, that's a cue that reminds us of what we need to do next, which is to teach kids what kinds of things that they need. And then restorative practices, they're really the vessel for determining how to learn from and address harm. So that's not the fix, it's the way that we bring people together to figure out what comes next. And last but not least, we can still have those high expectations, but we have to pair them with those high levels of supports.
Thank you, Christina. Let's move to our last slide so that they can get access to our contact information. I just want to thank you all so much for your time today. And of course, thank you, Christina, for a wonderful presentation. We've had so much engagement, so many thoughtful questions and answers during our time together. And I know you worked really hard to put together a very engaging and fantastic presentation for us. So many, many thanks from the Sanford team. We hope to have you back with us. Do you have any last comments for our audience?
No, just please reach out if there's any way that you want to, if you need resources or if you want to partner. Peace Learning Center has a website, pretty easy to find, and I wrote a book about, it's called The Secret of the Troublemakers. That's why that's my Twitter handle. That's not necessarily in reference to my restorative work. So thank you, everybody. This was a really, really fun group. This is my idea of a good time. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And just a couple reminders. So a lot of people are asking whether or not we're going to be sharing the slides. We will actually be sharing the recording of the webinar in 24 to 48 hours. So please stay tuned for that. We won't be sharing the slides themselves, but we will be sharing the recording. So for those of you, if you know anyone who registered and missed out and couldn't attend the webinar today, they will also get a link to the recording. And one more reminder is after this webinar closes shortly, a quick, very quick survey is going to launch. It only has 4 questions. It should take you less than a minute to fill out. We really appreciate your feedback. We really look at your feedback. It helps us make better webinars for you in the future. So if you could take just a second of your time to fill out that survey, that would be awesome. And with that, I am going to let you all go and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. I just want to thank you all again, and please stay tuned for our next webinar series. It should launch up again in fall. So if you have any questions, though, please feel free to email me. My email is right there, rscabito@nu.edu. I can forward you to the right people if you want to get Sanford Harmony started at your school. And obviously there's Christina's Twitter handle if you need to contact her. And with that, I will let you all go. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks.